I'm joined today by Brandon Garbutt, Managing Director of Capital Legacy, and we're talking about the importance of a will when it comes to property ownership. Thanks so much for joining me today, Brandon.
Thanks, Lean. Thanks a lot for having me.
South Africa doesn't have a very good track record when it comes to savings and being risk averse. We actually have a legacy of being indebted considerably. Is the picture any different when it comes to having a will? And do you know how many South Africans have a will or don't have a will?
Yes, Lean. We actually have seen exactly what you discussed now with regards to wills. I mean, if I take a step back to where Capital Legacy began almost a decade ago, our first thrust into the market was to make sure that there was more valid and up-to-date wills done in South Africa. And the reason was because wills always seem as if I can say the perverse of the wealthy. That if you didn't have any assets or cash, you didn't need a will. You know, the stats come out that say that 75% of people don't actually have a will. It's probably actually close to about 80% of people don't actually have a valid and up-to-date will. Mm-hmm. So, and we still, I mean, we've been going for almost a decade now. We're doing over 6,500 wills a month. And we still actually see those stats.
Okay. Yeah, that is quite a high percentage. So what are the biggest risks associated with not having a will? As you said, people think you need to have heaps and heaps of money, assets. Can you talk us through this? More specifically, what are the implications of this when it comes to owning property and not having a will?
Remember, your will is your last wish of how you would like to see your last wishes granted. And if we look at that, often your last wishes when it comes to a family is to do with the kids. Now, when it comes to property, it's very, very important that a will is actually put in place. And the reason I say that is if you were to pass away without a will, what we call that is interstate. So you pass away interstate, that means you don't have a will when you passed away. We have a law in South Africa called interstate law of succession, and that is a prescribed guide of how assets need to be distributed to your family. And you obviously have to follow that because it's a law, and whoever's winding up with the executor of the estate or is appointed as executor has to actually follow those prescribed steps. Now, the problem with that is what you intended, especially in a property circumstance, to happen to your property might not actually happen because it doesn't fall within the law. So I'll give an example. If you actually wanted your house to go to your sister, but you actually have children, or you got a spouse and children, the law of interstate succession would mean that it would follow a certain linear line and would actually go to your spouse, then go to your kids, etc. And they're not actually following in terms of what you actually intended or you actually wanted as a wish. So that's the first instance, which is a bit of a problem. Second instance is if you actually have a minor, and this we often see. So in other words, if you have children and they're under the age of 18, what happens is if there's no will, and a guardian sort of takes sort of I wouldn't say the word ownership, but the property is signed over to them in their control because the minor cannot take an asset under the age of 18. What happens is nothing can actually happen to that property until the minor reaches the age of 18. So the property actually cannot be sold. Nothing can happen until the minor reaches the age of 18. Now you might think, okay, it could be 2-3 years away. But you and I both know, Celine, if you were given assets, large amounts of money, houses at 18, you're probably not going to make the best decision there and then as well. But going back to the plan is if you have a really young minor, nothing can actually happen to the property until they turn 18. But what can actually happen is it's a costly exercise that you can apply to the High Court, and the High Court can deem that you can sell that property or rent it out, etc., or do something with the property. But again, it's a costly exercise, and you actually have to make an application to the High Court.
And it also raises the question of costs. If there is a bond on that property, what happens then? Because the minor can't be responsible for the payments.
Well, exactly. So we've actually had many cases, and that was going to be my third example, where no will's in place, and the child is supposed to inherit the property. There's quite a large bond on it. The parent passes away, expecting the child, I'm going to leave the property to my child, like everyone thinks it's great, but then you forget that there was the bond there. And what an executor would actually have to do is then possibly sell that property to obviously pay off the bond because the funds would go into the estate, and then the the bond would be settled, and your intention was to give the child the property, that actually hasn't happened.
So it all comes down to making sure everything is in place while you're still alive, knowing exactly where you're going with your assets.
Zena, there's an example I always like to give where things, and it's not just the will. We preach to the financial advisors to make sure that when you do the will, it matches your financial plan. And we had a case about a year or two ago where an individual was married and had a child, and he got divorced. And what happened was he got remarried to another person, and he had in his will, everything was going to the estate, and the beneficiary of the estate was the minor. But he had actually taken out life cover, and that life cover was intended to pay off the bond of the house. But what actually happened was the financial advisor at the time and him, they didn't actually look at the plan properly or the will properly. And they actually made his new spouse the beneficiary of that life cover.
Okay.
So then what actually happened was when he passed away, all of a sudden the house goes to the estate, and the beneficiary of the estate is the minor, but now there's a bond. Now we had to then, as the executors, go to the new spouse and go, well, actually the intention of the life cover was pay off the bond. And she was saying, no, it wasn't. It was life cover left to me. I've got this money. And she was well within her rights to say it. Mm-hmm. Now, what should have actually happened was in the will, everything was to go to the estate, and the beneficiary of the estate was the child. When they did the life cover should have then beneficiary been to the estate, money would have gone to the estate, paid off the bond, and the child would have inherited the property.
That sounds so complicated. So you really want to make sure your broker is doing the checks and balances, because you've got different policies happening in different places which don't always align. This brings us to the new offering from Capital Legacy, which
you're bringing to the market, which is Home Vantage.
100%. So if we actually take a step back about 18 months ago, is we actually looked at the way property is often bought and sold within South Africa. Mm-hmm. And we found a few problems. One of them being is your financial advisor is always allowed to control all your financial planning, except generally for most people, their biggest asset, which is their home. So you can advise on anything except the bond and the home. So you can tell you exactly what to do with your money, except your biggest asset, I can't tell you what to do or help you with it. So that was the first thing. We wanted to try and see how can we get the financial advisor who's building that financial plan and doing that will get more involved when you're purchasing your biggest asset. That was the first problem. The second problem that we actually saw was that when you purchase a bond, there are so many different entities that are all involved within the bond purchase. And what I mean by that is you obviously, once you've purchased the house from the estate agent, you'll obviously then apply for the bond, and you'll either go through a bond originator or you'll go through your bank. So that's one entity. Then the bank will actually say to you, the bank who's granting you the bond will often say that you need to take out bond cover or life cover. And they will generally push you towards whether it's a bank broker or a friendly advisor, and they'll make you take out life cover. So now you're dealing with a second person. Then they say, before you get the bond, you need to take out homeowner's cover. So that's the insurance for the bricks and mortar in case something were to happen to your house, not your contents, the actual building. And that you have to deal with a third person. And then what we've said is you want to wrap all of that up in your will, and you'd come to a company like Capital Legacy, which is a fourth entity. And actually all you ever wanted, Celine, was just to buy a house. Okay, now you're dealing with all these different entities. It becomes a complicated process. So we wanted to integrate or streamline that whole process where from purchasing a house, you're dealing with one entity. You're actually dealing with one person who's going to do the bond cover, do the HIC, and wrap it all up in the will that it all makes sense. So if you intended for the life cover to cover the bond on the property, it's in your will and it's actually structured that way. And you deal with one company and one individual for the whole process through.
You've given me some details about Capital Legacy's new product offering. And I see there that it includes 50% off transfer and bond registration fees, as well as starting the first-time buyers off in their home. Can you share a bit more about these benefits?
We wanted to create an integrated process whereby you deal with one entity and one individual. But what we found is, and many people have bought a home, what do you actually get besides getting a competitive rate? What do you actually get from either your originator or from your bank once you've got the bond? Yeah, it's basically a competitive rate. People always talk prime or prime less, and that's pretty much it. And we said that by going through an integrated process, there possibly has to be more that we can do from an entity to actually enhance the purchasing of the property. So we've got two elements that we actually call our home vantage products. And what happens is when you purchase home, as you know, there are attorney fees that you obviously got to pay up front. And what we do at Home Vantage is we'll pay back almost 50% of those attorney fees back to the individual upon registration as what we call as a home starter benefit. So you can use that money as you see fit. We really try and encourage you as a home starter benefit, fit out new curtains, buy new tiles, new furniture. It really is a home starter benefit, but that 50% is paid over to the individual upon registration, which is quite nice. It's a nice little give back from our side. The other point that you alluded to was what we call the bond accelerator benefit. What we've said there is an individual, when they take out the Home Vantage product, can choose a term anywhere between 10 and 15 years. And you can say at that point, so let's use 15 years as the example, at year 15, I want my bond accelerator to pay out. And what happens is in year 15, a cash amount of between 8 to 12% of what the original bond value was gets paid out in year 15 to the actual individual to hopefully pay off a lot of the bond or to actually settle the bond. And it's not an either or, you actually get both benefits. You get the home starter and you get the bond accelerator benefit when you come through Home Vantage.
That certainly does make it sound appealing. Another benefit you mentioned is succession planning. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
What we've often seen in this market, Celine, is that it's, I wouldn't say high net worth individuals, but it's individuals who've garnered quite a few assets over time. It could be a second property. Affordability is not a problem in terms of the property. And it's sort of people who are quite astute from a financial point of view. And what they're doing is they might not want to purchase the home in their own name. They might be purchasing in a company. They might be purchasing in the form of a trust. And what we do in succession planning is that we will structure all of that for you. So it's, I like to call it, it's our high net worth offering to the market, whereby we obviously do the will like we normally do at Capital Legacy. We look after the fees of when you pass away and wind up the estate like we normally do. But we also do the whole setup of the structure when purchasing a property and how that will fit into your portfolio. So if you were to purchase it and you want to put it through a company, or you put it in a company name, or if you want to put it through a trust, we will actually set up that whole structure for you and help administer it for you with the property in that entity.
Then for our audience, how do they get in touch or how do they take advantage of Home Vantage?
So I must say, since we actually launched, we've had a tremendous amount of interest. We obviously launched to the financial advisor market, where I said you had almost 5,000 advisors join our online launch. And we officially launching it as 1 October. The product will be available to the market. We are going through financial advisors, so you can contact your financial advisor and ask them about Home Vantage through Capital Legacy, or otherwise you can go onto our website where you can contact us at www.capitallegacy.co.za, and we will set up an appointment for one of our consultants to come out and run through the whole process that I actually discussed with you. And remember, that is the one person that you're going to be dealing with, which is such a nice thing to have, instead of having 4 or 5 different individuals and entities.
So if you have an established relationship with a financial planner, they should be able to just tap into that. You don't then necessarily need to take all of your interest over to somebody new. So that's really convenient.
100%.
Okay. And then, in these tough economic times that we find ourselves in, having a bond accelerator kick in round about now would have been fantastic, but unfortunately, it's not necessarily the case. What kind of advice do you have for our audience?
Sure. So we live in quite a strange time. So where people need to be a bit more conservative, but we know that people are really struggling. There's some really unfortunate individuals out there at the moment who've lost jobs, or they've had to, their income's kind of been lost or has been lowered. But then you come to a thing like the property market, and if you chat to any of the bond originators who we deal with quite a lot, they're actually having a booming trade at the moment because the interest rates are so low at the moment and keep going lower. It's making purchasing property quite attractive. But as I always say, I'm quite a conservative individual. So I always say, if you're going to go into purchasing a property now, which is a large asset, which we're discussing at the moment, make sure that you can't just afford it. You must be able to say that I can afford it comfortably. If there's an interest rate increase, I'm fine with that. This is a long-term investment for me, and I'm comfortable to purchase the property now, not join the wave of, well, let's just buy property because interest rates are low. Because, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, interest rates could shoot up. So if you said to me now, what would your advice be? I'd say take advantage of things like a low interest rate, but make sure that you can afford quite comfortably what you're actually getting into.
Some sound advice there. Thank you so much for your time, Brandon.
Thank you, Celine. Appreciate the time.